The history of the Szekely Lands in Romania. A unique piece of Romania. It's strange the things that can exist within a continent that most people think they know that go completely unnoticed. Ask most people in Western Europe today about an ethnic minority in Romania called the Szekleys, and one will probably get a confused look, followed by an admission that they have never heard of them. And yet the Szekleys dominate a substantial part of central Romania, where there are over 500,000 of them living in the Szekely Lands, or Szeklerland. There is even a regional movement for the Szekleys to be governed within an autonomous region inside Romania here. While in centuries gone by, many Szekleys adhered to one of Europe's more peculiar religions to emerge out of the Protestant Reformation, Szekler Sabbatarianism, a blend of Unitarianism and mystical forms of Judaism. You're probably wondering why such an ethnic minority isn't more well known about. The answer is that the Szekleys are often simply categorized as parts of the wider Hungarian minority that make up well over 1 million people in Romania as a whole. But the Szekleys and the lands which they inhabit in central Romania really ought to be understood on their own terms, and their history viewed as somewhat distinct from that of the wider Hungarian people. The origins of the Szekely people. The origin of the Szekely people is something of a conundrum. They first appear in the historical record as part of a confederacy which the Magyars, the medieval name for the Hungarian people, led into Europe in the 9th century. Thereafter, they formed a part of this wider Magyar confederacy as they conquered and settled across the Carpathian Basin, the lowlands which dominate the northern end of the Balkans. We know that they should be viewed as a somewhat distinct group from the more numerous Magyars, for the simple reason that texts written during the High Middle Ages refer to them as such. For instance, one of the foremost works on the early history of the Hungarian people, the Gesta Hungarorum, meaning the deeds of the Hungarians, written in the early 13th century, makes a distinction between the Szekleys and the Magyars. So, who were there? It would be logical to trace the history of the Magyars and assume that the Szekleys came from a similar place to Europe, though this is complicated by the simple fact that no one is 100% clear where the Magyars came from either. The most widely accepted theory today is that they migrated from somewhere just to the east or northeast of the Caspian Sea, possibly around the lower slopes of the Ural Mountains, westwards across the Pontic-Caspian steppe to Ukraine and then the Balkans in the 8th and 9th centuries. The logical conclusion then would be that the Szekleys either came with the Magyars from the Ural Mountains, or that they joined them somewhere along the way across the Pontic-Caspian steppe. The author of the Gesta Hungarorum claimed that they were a remnant of the Huns who had built up a large nomadic empire stretching from Hungary eastwards into modern-day Ukraine in the 5th century, a certainly not implausible theory. This being said, most historians today tend to categorize the Szekleys as being a closely related group to the Magyars, a kind of sub-denomination. This need not necessarily invalidate the identification of them with the Huns. A recent genetic study has argued that a large number of groups which migrated across Eurasia between the 5th and 9th centuries, notably including the Huns, Avars, and Magyars, were all related to groups that migrated from the Asian steppe in the early 1st century millennium CE that were identified in Chinese texts as the Xiongnu, or Asian Huns. Hence, the Szekleys were quite possibly both descendants of the Huns and close cousins of the Magyars, from a genetic perspective, making them closely tied to modern-day Hungarians. The Szekleys in the Kingdom of Hungary. The question of the origins of the Szekleys is an important one, for it is not entirely sure if the Szekely were involved in the initial conquest of Hungary along with the Magyars. This occurred in the late 9th and early 10th centuries as they moved into this lowland region south of the Carpathian Mountains, which had formed part of the First Bulgarian Empire, which was declining as a power just as the Magyars arrived. By the late 10th century, the Magyars had become the dominant power in the Carpathian Basin, and King Stephen thus founded the Kingdom of Hungary around the turn of the millennium. He soon expanded into Transylvania and what is now eastern Romania, and the region was colonized by large numbers of Hungarians and Germans in the High Middle Ages. The Szekely were soon among them. They may have been involved in the Hungarian conquests even earlier. One theory is that the Szekely were deeply involved with the Magyars in the Hungarian conquest of the Carpathian Basin, and that they are synonymous with the Eskil people noted in some of the medieval chronicles detailing these events. What is certain is that the Szekely were inhabiting Transylvania by 1200, and we find numerous records referring to the Secula Centurionatus, or Szekely 100, in the early 13th century. This was clearly a military contingent of Szekely that provided service to the kings of Hungary on the Transylvania frontier of the Kingdom of Hungary. Hence, the Szekely were established in Szeklerland as a kind of warrior aristocracy on the frontier of the Hungarian kingdom during the 12th and 13th century. The geography of the Szekely Land. The geography of the Szeklerland has remained consistent for approximately 800 years. It lies on the far eastern side of Transylvania, which is within central Romania. The lands in question dominate the counties of Harghita and Covasna, and also a substantial part of the country of Mureș. That means Szeklerland is a relatively cohesive unit within central Romania and has been for hundreds of years, though some Szekely people also live in other parts of Romania, and there was a considerable migration of Szekely people to Bukovina in northeastern Romania in the mid-18th century, following a notorious massacre of them in Szeklerland, which we will hear more about later. When they first settled here in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, the Szekely may have received the right to colonize these lands from the Hungarian crown owing to the poor nature of the land, it being high land on the edges of the Carpathian Mountains. It was also land that would have to be defended from the Romanians to the east and the Bulgars to the south. Today there are numerous large towns and cities in the region. The foremost is Târgu Mureș in Mureș, the 16th largest city in Romania, with a population of over 100,000 people. It lies on the Mureș River, the second largest river in Romania after the Danube, and a key geographical feature of the Szeklerland, both in medieval and modern times. Other substantial towns include Odorheiu Secuiesc, Târgu Secuiesc, and Covasna. The region is dotted with fortified medieval churches and castles such as Mico Castle, which testify to both an advanced architectural style in Szeklerland over the centuries and how the built environment was both religious and governmental, and also geared towards military defense at all times in what was a frontier society between warring powers over many centuries. The Szekely in the late medieval era. Here in Szeklerland, the Szekely people lived under a feudal lord appointed by the kings of Hungary. He was awarded the title of Count of the Szekleys. The first such count was Bogomir Ludani, appointed by King Andrew II in 1228. Generally speaking, the counts were ethnic Magyars rather than Szekleys, and this was a means of the Hungarian crown exercising control over the Szeklerland. Despite this, the Szekely always maintained that they enjoyed special privileges which made them a quasi-autonomous people within the Kingdom of Hungary, an independent streak which has survived over many centuries. This was a warrior society in the late medieval era under Hungarian rule. A large percentage of Szekely males were warriors. Land was held in a communal manner to some extent and was worked in such a fashion so as to free young and middle-aged men up to be able to campaign militarily. This impacted on a broad range of social customs in medieval Szeklerland. For instance, daughters could only inherit land if they had no surviving brothers, as the land was viewed primarily as a means of supporting male fighters. If a daughter did inherit a large estate in the absence of a male sibling, then she was expected to provide for the upkeep of a warrior who was not a direct relative. Much of this was hardly unusual in medieval Europe, a feudal warrior aristocracy society, but it was somewhat peculiar in terms of the scale of it. The Szekely warriors had to confront a range of enemies. Not long after they acquired their lands in eastern Transylvania, they encountered a dangerous new enemy as the Mongols raided into the Kingdom of Hungary for the first time in the early 1240s following their vast and rapid conquest of much of Asia. Roman Catholicism largely prevailed amongst the Szekley by the 14th century, and we find Szeklerland divided into parishes around that time so that ecclesiastical taxes could be levied by the church. Around the same time, a gradual change in the political situation began. The local Szekely aristocrats acquired greater freedoms ruling from 7 széks, or local lordships. They also increasingly owed their feudal allegiances to the voivode of Transylvania, a local prince that was becoming more and more independent of the kings of Hungary. There were 3 such voivodes in Romania in late medieval times, specifically the voivode of Transylvania in the west, the voivode of Wallachia in the south, and the voivode of Moldavia in the north. The title of voivode of Transylvania went back to the early 11th century, when it was essentially established as an administrative position under the kings of Hungary. Over time, though, the holders of the office became more and more independent. Ladislaus III Khan, voivode of Transylvania from 1295 to around 1315, could be viewed as the first independent voivode of Transylvania and prince in his own right. The Szekely increasingly owed their allegiances to figures like Ladislaus rather than the kings of Hungary from the early 14th century onwards, though the situation was always fluid, with some more effective Hungarian rulers like Matthias Corvinus, king of Hungary between 1458 and 1490, managing to reassert royal authority over Transylvania and the Szekely on occasion. The rise of the Ottomans. The position of the Szekely people and other groups within the Eastern Balkans was soon being shaped by a new power in the region. Like the Slavs, Magyars, Szekely, and other groups, the Turkic people had begun migrating from northern Asia way back in the 5th and 6th centuries. They came from an even remoter place than most of these groups that had come to Europe, hailing from Siberia and parts of Russia that lie along the border with Mongolia and China today. They also migrated in strange ways. Many Turkish groups headed directly south and invaded northern and eastern China. Others did migrate directly west towards the Pontic-Caspian steppe in the manner which the Slavs, Magyars, and Szekely did. But the majority headed southwest into Central Asia, while some Turkish groups went even further, moving south of the Caspian Sea into the Middle East. The Ottoman Turks that began conquering large parts of Anatolia in the early 14th century were descendants of the latter. After acquiring control over much of what is now Turkey, they crossed over into the Balkans and gained footholds in Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Greece. In 1453, they did the unthinkable and conquered the city of Constantinople, bringing the Byzantine Empire to an end after 1,000 years. And they didn't stop there. The Ottoman Empire continued to expand at breathtaking speed in the second half of the 15th century and into the 16th, eventually conquering nearly all of the Middle East and North Africa. In 1526, they defeated a great confederacy of Christian powers in the Balkans, led by King Louis II of Hungary at the Battle of Mohacs. Over the next 2 decades, they consolidated their control over the Balkans. The voivodesses of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia in Romania, which included the Szekely Lands, would always remain one of the most peripheral parts of the Ottoman Empire, with the local princes managing to establish varying degrees of independence at times, though always acknowledging the sultans in Constantinople as their nominal overlords, a situation which would continue in one vein or another until the establishment of the Kingdom of Romania following the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. Thus, the story of the Szekely lands and people between the 16th and 19th centuries is broadly one of the rise and fall of Turkish rule in the Balkans and efforts to reassert Christian rule. The Szekleys under Ottoman rule. Ottoman rule was only imposed gradually in Transylvania, and thus in the Szekely lands in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. Thousands of Szekely fighters joined a holy league that was formed in the mid-1590s to try and push the Ottomans out of Hungary and other parts of the Balkans. They were unsuccessful overall, despite initial victory at the Battle of Giurgiu in 1595. Following this success, the Szekely reasserted their traditional freedoms in Szeklerland, an action which led to Stephen Bocsai, the Hungarian claimant to the Principality of Transylvania, to engage in a massacre of the Szekely in 1596 that became known as the Bloody Carnival. This was the beginning of an era in which the Szekleys wrestled between periods of Ottoman rule, then efforts by the Hungarians to reassert control over Transylvania, and also periods in which local rulers like the Gabor family arose in Transylvania in the 17th century. As the Bloody Carnival indicates, Christian rule or the rule of their Hungarian cousins was not necessarily better for the Szekely than living under Ottoman suzerainty. The Protestant Reformation in the Szekely lands. A significant development during this era came in the sphere of religion. Usually, when we think of the Protestant Reformation, we think of Western and Central Europe, places like Germany, where it started, and then England and the Low Countries, where Protestantism was adopted, or Spain and Italy, where the Inquisition ensured the triumph of Roman Catholicism. The Reformation impacted all of Europe, though, even the Balkans. While the Austrian Habsburgs tried their best to clamp down on any Protestant fervor in the lands they ruled, and were quite successful in doing so in Austria itself, Bohemia, the pre-modern name for Czechia, had been a hotbed of religious dissent since the time of Jan Hus, a religious reformer of the early 15th century. The work of Martin Luther and the other Protestant reformers in Germany, Switzerland, and the Low Countries in the late 1510s and 1520s reignited the reform movement in Bohemia, and it spread from there into Hungary. By the second half of the 16th century, there were communities of Protestants emerging in Transylvania and other parts of the Eastern Balkans, particularly amongst ethnically Hungarian people and their close ethnic cousins, like the Szekleys. What was more, by the second half of the 16th century, the Protestant Reformation had begun to spawn all manner of new radical Christian sects around the continent, groups like the Methodists, Baptists, Arminians, and Socinians. One of these groups proliferated in particular amongst the Szekleys. This was Unitarianism. In this branch of Christianity, the concept of the Holy Trinity of God, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit is generally rejected in favor of the idea of a unitary conception of God, where Jesus and the Holy Spirit are essentially aspects of God's person and power, rather than a distinct trio of beings. Unitarians also rejected a wide variety of established church teaching and began to adhere to what they believed was a purer form of Christian worship. In Transylvania, the Unitarian movement had one of its foremost leaders in all of Europe in the person of Ferenc David, a Transylvanian Saxon who had spent part of the 1540s in Germany, where he became convinced of the wisdom of the Reformation movement. Returning to Transylvania, he established the Unitarian Church of Transylvania. Though founded in what is now Romania, it had a very large proportion of ethnically Hungarian, Szekely, and Saxon adherents in the decades that followed. This Unitarianism was controversial enough in the Balkans, where Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodox Christianity, and Islam were the main religions. The Szekleys, though, were soon adhering to a new religion altogether: Szekely Sabbatarianism. The new religious movement that emerged in the Szekely Lands was started by a German. Matthias Wehe was a Protestant religious radical who had fled from Central Europe in the 1570s after his Calvinism became too radical for the local authorities. He headed southeast to Hungary and eventually ended up in Transylvania. By that time, he had begun to reject the idea of the Trinity altogether and was espousing a form of Christian belief which adopted large elements of Judaism. He arrived to Transylvania around the time Ferenc David was arrested on account of his religious views. Since David would soon die in prison, Wehe managed to acquire a position of seniority within the Unitarian movement in Transylvania. Over the next period, he essentially founded a movement known as Szekely Sabbatarianism. Though he himself was German, the movement primarily acquired followers from amongst the Szekleys, notably a wealthy official in the Szekely Lands, Simon Pécsi, and a prominent Szekely nobleman, András Orsi. Together they built their congregation in the 1580s, 1590s, and 1600s. The Sabbatarians gradually grew to reject virtually all of the New Testament. They decided that Jesus was simply a human prophet rather than a divine Son of God, and they placed much greater emphasis on the Old Testament and other Jewish texts. Their name, Sabbatarians, was derived from their placing especial importance on the Sabbath, a concept which was part of Christianity but which had been devised by the Jewish people thousands of years earlier. Jewish dietary habits and other customs were also adopted, though not circumcision. By the early 17th century, the Szekely Sabbatarians were experiencing extensive persecution from the local Romanian princes and authorities and other powers. After a particularly intense crackdown in the 1630s and 1640s, many Szekleys stopped worshipping openly, pretending outwardly to be Unitarians, while privately continuing to adhere to Sabbatarianism. In the second half of the 19th century, there were still hundreds of Szekely Sabbatarians, and many converted to Judaism at that time. A very small number eventually ended up settling in what became Israel in the 20th century as long-standing Jewish converts, though not ethnically Jewish. On the Austrian military frontier. While these religious developments were notable, it is important to remember that many Szekely people remained in the mainstream of Christian belief and continued to adhere to Roman Catholicism and pre-Reformation strands of Christianity. There appears to have been virtually no conversion to Islam, despite the rise of Ottoman power in the Balkans. Elsewhere, large numbers of people had converted to Islam in order to prosper under Turkish rule, particularly so in Albania and Bosnia. But this was not the case in the Romanian lands. This was partly because the lands of Wallachia, Transylvania, and Moldavia always remained more of a nominal vassal of the Ottomans than a fully conquered region. Moreover, where regions like Bulgaria, Albania, and Serbia would remain firmly under Ottoman rule until well into the 19th or even early 20th centuries, the Romanian principalities were some of the first to split from the Turks. After the siege of Vienna in 1683, a worrying moment in which the Ottomans had nearly seized the capital of the Austrian state, a Christian alliance or Holy League of the Poles, Austrians, Russians, Venetians, and some German states began pushing the Ottomans southwards. Transylvania was reacquired by the Austrians in 1699 at the end of the Great Turkish War, which raged for a decade and a half between the Holy League and the Turks after the siege of Vienna. This brought the Szekely people and their lands back under Christian rule, this time in the shape of the Austrian Habsburgs rather than an independent Hungarian kingdom. Over the next 2 centuries, the Szekely would form one of the ethnic groups on the frontier of the Austrian Empire, a militarized frontier zone that often experienced war with the Turks and sometimes had to contend with Turkish raids even when the two countries were not at war. Massacre at Madéfalva. It was during this era, as part of the frontier between the Austrian and Ottoman empires, that one of the most notorious incidents in the history of the Szekely people occurred. It took place on the night of the 7th of January 1764 in the village of Madéfalva, modern-day Szeklerland. This is known today as the Massacre at Madéfalva, or the Szeklerland. The previous year, the Habsburg government had authorized one of its leading generals, Adolf Nikolaus von Buchow, to recruit a large number of detachments from the border territories in expectation of a potential new war with the Turks. Soldiers in the Szekely Lands in Transylvania objected to the new directive, particularly the idea that they would serve under Austrian commanders rather than their own leaders. In response to the agitation, a contingent of the Habsburg army under Joseph von Siskowitz entered Madéfalva under cover of darkness on the night of the 7th of January 1764. In the hours that followed, approximately 400 Szekely people, including women and children, were massacred in the town. Hundreds fled in the early hours of the morning, and many migrated to Moldavia, where they settled amongst the Changos, another small ethnic minority in the Eastern Balkans, who, like the Szekely, are closely related to the Magyars, though a slightly different branch of Hungarian ethnicity. Many Szekely remain where they resettled there at the time in what is northeastern Romania. More broadly, the massacre at Madéfalva is remembered by the Szekely as a dark though important event in their collective history, symbolizing their persecution under numerous different powers in Romania over the centuries. The Szekely Lands in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Szekely were part of the wider emergence of Romanian nationalism in the 19th century, though they wished to express their own unique identity as part of the Hungarian community in Transylvania, though also as one of numerous Hungarian sub-ethnicities like the Changos. Several Szekely intellectuals and scholars emerged in the late 18th century who stressed the unique history and culture of the Szekely, and this led to a vibrant Szekely nationalist movement into modern times. In the series of revolutions which swept across Europe in 1848, the Szekleys joined the wider Hungarian cause after a breakaway government or diet was formed in Pest to oppose continuing Austrian domination of Hungary. It successfully opposed Austrian attempts to militarily defeat the revolution. The Szekleys contributed tens of thousands of troops to the Hungarian cause, and there was some talk in Pest about how to establish semi-independence for Szeklerland. However, both Hungarian and Szekely hopes of independence were crushed the following year, when Russia intervened to ally with the Austrian government and suppress the Hungarian insurrection. Hungary was placed under martial law for nearly 20 years thereafter, until such time as defeat in the Austro-Prussian War forced the government in Vienna to adopt a more conciliatory approach to the many ethnic minorities which made up its empire. Hence, in 1867, the Austrian Empire became the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Once the Hungarians became partners of the Austrians in a dual empire, they quickly forgot about the nationalist concerns of their Szekely cousins in Transylvania. Instead, the new Hungarian government that ruled large parts of the Austro-Hungarian Empire from Budapest, a city formed from the unification of the towns of Buda and Pest around this time, set about reorganizing local government in Hungary and Transylvania. The old Szekely sects or seats were abolished, and county government was imposed. The establishment of the dual empire had once again seen the Szekely marginalized. The First World War and the Treaty of Trianon. The Szekely remained under the rule of the Hungarian part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire for half a century after the Compromise of 1867. They would find themselves at the heart of a new political tug-of-war during this time. In 1878, a Romanian state came into being for the first time after Wallachia and Moldavia obtained their independence from the Ottoman Empire at the end of the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 1878. The Kingdom of Romania, as it became in the early 1880s, had a strong claim to Transylvania itself. While Hungarian groups like the Szekleys inhabited parts of Transylvania, other parts were dominated by Romanians, and the two ethnic groups lived interspersed amongst each other as well. Even to this day, Romanians make up about a quarter of the population of the Szekely Lands in eastern Transylvania. Consequently, the new Romanian state held it as a matter of course that it wished to obtain control over Transylvania at some future point during an era when the borders of the newly emergent Balkan states were very fluid. That opportunity came during the First World War. Romania remained neutral at first, but in 1916 it decided to enter the conflict on the side of Britain, France, and Russia, with the goal of obtaining control of Transylvania. Although the war effort went very badly for Romania, it won the peace as a part of the victorious alliance. Furthermore, when the Austro-Hungarian Empire collapsed late in 1918 and Hungary descended into revolution and violence, Romania invaded Transylvania and Hungary. Thus, the Szekely lands were militarily occupied in 1919, and in 1920, the Treaty of Trianon saw Transylvania, the Szekely lands included, ceded to Romania. Hence, the Szekleys became a subject people of the Kingdom of Romania. It is from this point that the Szekleys and the other Hungarian groups in Transylvania and places like Bukovina began to be regarded much more broadly as simply Hungarians in Romania, rather than acknowledging their distinct identities as Magyars, Szekely, and Csangos. The Szekely minority in Romania through war and dictatorship. The Szekely and wider Hungarian minority in Romania were subject to a program of Romanianization from the 1920s onwards, a state policy in Romania which sought to break down the ethnic identity of the Hungarian minorities and more fully incorporate them into the Romanian state, particularly in Transylvania and places like Szeklerland, that had a strong history of independence and resistance to foreign control, be it in the shape of the Ottomans, the Austrians, or the Romanians. This was also directed against other ethnic minorities in Romania like the Roma, Sinti, and Jewish community. On the 30th of August 1940, at the height of Nazi Germany's power in Europe, it established the Second Vienna Award, whereby its ally, Hungary, was re-granted control of Transylvania with the Szekely lands, which it had lost 20 years earlier through the Treaty of Trianon. A military coup was launched in Romania just days later in response to this national setback, and a fascist government was established, one which enthusiastically joined the Nazi Axis alliance. In the years that followed, Romania became one of the most conspicuous participants in the Holocaust of Europe's Jews and other ethnic groups like the Roma and Sinti. Though it is almost entirely forgotten about today, the Szekleys also faced considerable persecution during the Second World War, as their history of adhering to Sabbatarianism since the late 16th century and its links to Judaism led to them being persecuted as Jewish sympathizers. Some Szekely who continued to adhere to Sabbatarianism were even sent to Auschwitz. At the end of the Second World War, Transylvania was once again returned to Romania. It had remained part of the country down to the present day, and so the Szekely Lands are not a core part of modern Romania. After the war, a communist regime gradually claimed power. In 1965, Nicolae Ceausescu established himself as dictator thereof. His rule was one of enormous corruption, authoritarianism, and human rights abuses. The Hungarian minorities, the Szekely included, were once again subjected to a policy of severe Romanianization down to his fall from power at the end of 1989. The modern-day Szekely autonomous movement. Romania has become a more stable and prosperous country since the end of the Ceausescu dictatorship. It made rapid advances towards becoming a member of the European Union and joined the bloc along with Bulgaria in 2007. EU membership accelerated a pattern of population decline in Romania in the post-Cold War period, with the country's population falling from a high of just over 23 million people in the late 1980s to just 19 million today, a sizable 17% decline in the overall population levels. As this has happened, the strength of the Szekely minority within the Szekely Lands has become even more pronounced. After all, the Szekely now make up about 3% of the population of Romania and are in the majority in Harghita, Covasna, and Mureș. A considerable Szekely autonomous movement calling for the Szekely people to have greater powers of local self-determination within the Szekely Lands has consequently emerged. The Szekler National Council was formed in 2003 to advocate for the regional autonomy of the Szekely people. Demonstrations involving thousands of Szekely people were held in the years that followed, while the first Szekely Autonomy Day was celebrated in 2015. It is marked every year on the last Sunday in October. The Szekely independence movement has also been controversial, and many political parties in Romania are opposed to efforts to grant greater autonomy to what are perceived as a Hungarian minority at a time when Hungary continues to claim that parts of Transylvania are rightly part of historic Hungary. Thus, the history of the Szekely lands and people in Romania are continuing to evolve in the early 21st century. If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe to the channel to show your support, and watch more content like this. Let us know your thoughts in the comments. That's it for now. We'll see you in the next one.